Hello everyone and welcome back to the Tortoise Cyber Summit. I'm Alexi Mostrous, I'm a partner and editor here, and this session is going to be all about, as James Harding said in the last session, cybersecurity spending. And internally this session has been known as the Lemons session because we're going to be talking about lemons in cybersecurity, substandard technology that is nevertheless purchased by companies for millions of pounds. We're going to be asking why and how to stop it. And all of this stems from a great report that was written by Joe Hubback, a managing director at ISTARI, called Market for Lemons. And we'll get to that in a second. But I just want to quickly introduce our other guests, and we've also got a special contributor, although I can't see him. He's at the back. We'll bring him on as a special guest halfway through. So Joe, I've mentioned. Grace Cassy is the founder of CyLon. It's supported more than 100 cyber security startups. Ciaran Martin is a professor at Oxford and the founding CEO of the National Cyber Security Centre. Most of the people in the room will know that already. And Greg Rattray, hey Greg, is the co-founder of cybersecurity firm NextPeak, but he's also had the career of 3 men. He's been the former global chief information officer at JP Morgan. He's a US Air Force colonel and was the director for cybersecurity at the White House. So welcome to all our guests, and our special contributor is Nick Coleman, the Chief Executive Officer in charge of cyber at Mastercard and the author of the Coleman report on cybersecurity. So we'll hear from Nick in a minute, but we've only got 50 minutes or so I'm just going to get on with it. Joe, let's start with you. Market for Lemons report. It starts with a really interesting paradox that cybersecurity spending is going up 60% a year, and security breaches are also going up 60% a year. And you're quoting one IT expert saying, "We buy it and cross our fingers and hope." So can you explain what's going on?
I wouldn't claim to be the one that's figured out what's going on, but I can at least share what I found in the report. So I spent most of last summer, while we were all in lockdown, interviewing CISOs, CIOs from the defensive side, as well as interviewing technology vendors, cybersecurity vendors, government regulators from around the world. And the thing I found was that more than 90% of people I spoke to said that the cybersecurity technologies they were buying were not as effective as either they'd promised to be or were hoped to be. So this is obviously a real problem, because people are spending an awful lot of money on cybersecurity, but we're still all suffering these attacks. So a lot of people have spent many years talking about, snake oil and, silver bullets. And my research sort of provides some evidence to support the fact that that's what real people are experiencing, is they're spending money on technology, but then it's not delivering on the promise.
And one of the problems I think you highlight in your report, or one of the causal factors that leads to this market for lemons, is an information asymmetry between the buyers of the products and the sellers of the products. Essentially, the sellers know a lot more than the buyers. Is that right? Yeah,
exactly. So the economists in the room will recognize the market for lemons as George Akerlof's work from the 1970s, where he described the second-hand car market, where you go along, you buy a second-hand car, and either you end up with a lemon or a peach, and the lemons are the ones that don't work as well as you hope they would. And the reason that was happening in the second-hand car market was because buyers were not able to actually effectively evaluate what they were buying. And there were no controls on the sellers to maintain a standard of quality before they could sell their product in the market. And what that does is it drives all the peaches out of the market, because it's not worth trying to sell a peach for the price of a lemon, which is where the market will clear. And unfortunately, there are some aspects of that market happening in cybersecurity today, in that the vendors of cybersecurity products obviously know a lot more about the efficacy of their solutions than the buyers. And buyers are under a huge amount of pressure to solve a problem. I don't know a CISO that sort of doesn't have a resting heart rate of 150 and is constantly terrified. And they will look for any solution, and they will trust very quickly what vendors are telling them about the efficacy of their solutions. And that then means that people end up spending money without really understanding the risk reduction that they're achieving from a solution. So actually, how much can this help me?
And just we'll come to solutions in a minute, but what controls are there to prevent snake oil salesmen in this industry? If you've got a cyber company and you're selling lemons, can you say my cyber solution does X when it patently doesn't?
So can I start by saying I don't know any cybersecurity companies that are knowingly selling lemons. And I interviewed quite a few as part of the research, and they actually agreed with the conclusions, but they think it's all the other cybersecurity companies that are doing it. But the things that, there are official sort of attempted efforts at solving this market for lemons. There are things like the common criteria, which are used especially in national security environments to evaluate security solutions. And in the consumer space, we're starting to see regulation coming into place around IoT and the security of doorbells or, et cetera. But what happens in the enterprise space, where most of the money is being spent on cybersecurity, is there are, market services such as Gartner and Forrester, but they have their own limitations. What seems to happen mostly is the Threema and Signal and WhatsApp groups where they phone their mates. And I asked the CISOs, how do you evaluate products at the moment? They say, well, you do the normal proof of concept. But to find out if it really works, I just text my mates who've already used it, or I find out who's already used this, what was their experience. And if your product dies in one of those WhatsApp groups, then you're not going to sell your product. But they're all unofficial. It's all, the network of friends. And I don't think that's a good enough solution for a very serious problem.
It doesn't seem a complete solution.
No.
Just before we turn to you, Ciaran, just on this market for lemons theory, was the original theory, did it suppose that the more time went on, the more lemons there would be, because there would be more incentive for them to be sold? So by that paradigm, does that mean that this problem in cybersecurity is getting worse? Are there more lemons next year than there will be this year?
I think without a change, there's a risk that will happen, yes, because if you look at the perfectly rational incentives of a cybersecurity vendor, you've got to get to market as quick as you can. So that might mean that you're cutting a few corners in the efficacy of your coding. It might mean you depend on some other people to do some stuff for you. It might mean you exaggerate a little bit how well it really works in order to make those sales. And that then compounds and becomes this problem where products end up on the market that are not as efficacious as they're supposed to be.
We'll get to solutions in a little bit, but I just want to pick up what the other guests think of Joe's findings. Ciaran, what is your reaction to the report? Are we being inundated with lemons in the cybersecurity space?
I think Joe's report was hugely valuable. I think for me, it coherently expressed a feeling that I'd been struggling to articulate. I remember early in my career, I ran cybersecurity in the UK government for about 6.5 years. I remember early in my tenure being taken to Tel Aviv, and of course Israel is very proud of it, and rightly so, of its massive sort of cybersecurity tech sector. And in Pier 13 on the seafront, it's massive marquee, and you do cybersecurity speed dating with venture capitalists. And I was taken around. This, and sort of asked to pretend and sort of dip my toe in the water. It didn't help that the brochure was in Hebrew, but never mind. And you went along, and there was this bewildering array of innovation, and you were trying to work out, well, which of this is going to cut it? And you ended up thinking there were probably 3 categories. There was a small number of genuine world-class sort of game-changing stuff. How do you find that? There was a bunch of stuff which was people doing existing things better, either more cheaply or more efficiently, or a combination of both. And then there was a bunch of stuff where you're not really sure what this was all about, and maybe it might not work, it might go under, and so forth. But then, what's the framework for doing that? You look at acquiring government capabilities, and we were looking at that. And there are parts of the market that work really well. I mean, if Dimitri was still on the screen, I would say it anyway, not just to keep him happy, but stuff like threat intelligence, you're quite a sort of mature market in it because people want it. But there are other parts where you're just saying, well, what does this do? And one sort of qualitative, so not metric, but one qualitative point is look at some of the advertising. You know, you see some adverts where people are saying, oh, here's somebody taking down a bank sending a message to a printer in a bank, and the institution collapses. Well, we all know that doesn't actually happen. You hear gibberish like, you know, your company will be crippled at machine speed and this artificially computes your response. You're going, what does that mean? So there's some real problems here, but there's some really, really good companies. And as Joe's report says, and it's a very nuanced and subtle report, that doesn't benefit the many good vendors out there, as well as the buyers. A couple other quick points, Alexi, because I think the market failure, if you like, goes beyond just, you know, this isn't just about, and it's certainly not about dishonest companies. It's about a market that struggles to work. And there are two other things. One is sort of externalities. There's a bunch of cybersecurity problems which nobody's got a commercial incentive to fix, and therefore nobody sells stuff to fix them. So if you take something like the infamous Mirai botnet that took down Twitter and Amazon 5 years ago, that's junk IoT that people are allowed to sell, and it gets hijacked. And you look at regulation, Dimitri's point in the last session, banks are well regulated for cyber resilience. Telecoms companies have not historically been. So there's a whole series of problems which can be summed up in a phrase: security often doesn't sell.
And Ciaran, you've spoken also, when you're talking about the other factors that might prohibit or get in the way of this market working properly, about the insurance industry. And it just seems, I mean, from an outsider's perspective, it seems crazy to me that a company faced with a cyber breach can pay the hackers and claim back from the insurance company and then keep it all under wraps. That doesn't seem to work in the public good.
Well, I agree with that. Plenty others don't. And, you know, you gotta, I suppose, when you look at the argument in its totality, you're thinking about people in desperate situations. They've taken out insurance in good faith. This is a cost, etc. But again, there's a public policy element to that. But I think the insurance challenge goes deeper than that. I mean, insurance normally is essentially a vehicle for social good. It may be quite boring and people don't like it and so forth, but basically it serves a useful social function by incentivizing people to protect themselves better, and then compensating them when, you know, well-managed risk goes wrong. Yeah. And it's happened to some extent in cyberspace and in the digital world, but not to the extent that I think we were envisaging 7 years ago. I remember accompanying a cabinet minister to a summit of the major London insurers, and the narrative was Britain's great at financial services and it's great at cybersecurity. So, you know, let's put the two together and off we go. Now, there are really complicated factors as to why that hasn't happened. One is it's really hard to price harm. What does a massive data breach cost? What harm does it do if you end up with 100 million records on the illicit web and some sort of marketplace there? Sometimes you can price it, sometimes you can't. It can be hard to price liability. There is international litigation when it's a nation-state attack. You know, is this some sort of act of war? Which I take the view that it's not, but people will say that. And so therefore it's quite hard to price risk. And we've gone from a period where, you know, in a sense, the insurance companies were in a good position in that all of those things meant that people were paying premiums and not having to pay out. With the ransomware crisis this year, you've had several companies, not just for sort of ethical reasons, like the AXA example, when they just said, we're not going to pay ransoms anymore, but people just saying it's not worth their while insuring ransomware anymore because with this massive social disruption of a colonial pipeline or so forth, it's just uninsurable.
But there are problems with insuring against cyber threats. But is there a problem more structurally with the ability of companies who have been hit by ransomware to effectively cover it up or not bring it to the public attention because they can just get their money back?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think there are. I mean, with ransomware in particular, there are a number of things. One is, I mean, I think there's a complex debate on should insurance be allowed to cover payments, should payments be legal, or should there be some restrictions on them? I don't think there's a complicated debate at all on reporting requirements. I mean, people ask all the time, what is the total cost of ransomware? And the answer is nobody really knows because it's very easy to pay in secret. I mean, one of the difference between 2021 and 2020 in ransomware is that in 2021, people noticed it was happening because there were fuel shortages and healthcare crises and schools weren't opening.
Right.
In 2020, it was more, there was some of that, but it was more people paying quietly and not reporting it. So how do you know how much that costs. So there is something, I mean, like the solutions to all of this do not lie solely in the hands of government, but whether it's, IoT product regulation, as Joe was hinting at, setting some sort of better framework for ransomware in particular and insurance in general, there is a big public policy element to it as well.
That's really interesting, and I really want to kind of come back to solutions. And if anyone in the room or online has ideas about solutions for this lemons problem, then put your hand up or catch my eye. I can see that there's a question over there. I just want to turn to Grace quickly first, though, to talk about CyLon and about how, in working with all these startups, which have always wonderful, wacky ideas, some are good, some are bad. How you separate the peaches from the lemons?
Well, hopefully we're not backing too many of the wacky ones, but no, it's the problem that Joe's research has highlighted is a real one, right? There's a huge fragmentation in this market. There are vast numbers of vendors. The description of Ciaran's trip to Israel, I think, is probably familiar to anyone in this room who's ever been to a cybersecurity conference and tried to go into an exhibition hall and been kind of fed upon by the piranhas at the stands. And it is a real issue. We have spent 5 or 6 years now trying to filter that noise and trying to identify in early stage companies signals that we believe will indicate a product or a team behind that product that will typically have a greater chance of success. And there are certain things we see around the background of the team building the product. It's almost to Joe's point in his report about provenance. You can almost apply the same logic about provenance to a team behind a product. What is their technical background? What is their track record in having perhaps built and scaled a product previously? Do they know how to integrate their product effectively with a customer? So you can look quite hard at those sort of issues. We very much try to seek input from some of the same people that Joe and Ciaran have referred to, the CISOs, the CIOs, the users of these products, because I think as much as there is an information asymmetry between the buyers and the sellers in terms of what they know about the product, our experience of the last 5 years very much suggests that there's an asymmetry for people trying to build products in really understanding what the buyers want and need, and what are real problems and what are problems that you might think are an issue, but maybe are not an actual practical issue at that moment for a buyer. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand from those users what are the real present issues that need to be resolved right now, and what do they think will be issues in future. So you're not, ideally you're not then backing the lemons, you're not contributing to the problem by giving oxygen to a startup that's just going to perpetuate this problem.
It's really interesting that the relationship between the technology and the customer is so important. I mean, are there quite a lot of cybersecurity solutions that are kind of technically valid, quite strong, but fail because customers don't implement them properly for one reason or another?
Yes, in our experience, that very much is a problem that we've heard earlier today. Various speakers talking about the complexity of enterprise IT environments, and this is it's a real issue. You have too many products, legacy systems that have been acquired through acquisition or whatever else, and you could have a wonderful new product that may even have passed an efficacy test of some sort, but if it cannot be integrated effectively into your existing complex environment, then it doesn't matter. And equally, another point I think others have touched upon a little today is, no matter how good your product is, and even if you have been able to integrate it effectively, if your people cannot operate it and your wider members of staff in your team are not aware of how to behave and how to take account of security in their daily lives, then it doesn't really matter, because you can lose everything through someone sending the wrong email to somebody or misusing a chat channel or something of that sort. And so you can have a situation where you have products that have passed an efficacy test and it's been perfectly integrated, but your people may still let you down. So you still have to ensure that you're upskilling, if you like, the cyber awareness and cyber skills of your whole workforce, not just the people you think are your security team.
That's really interesting. We're going to come to questions in a second. I see there's two people here and then Neil at the back. But can we just come to Greg for a second, because he's been waiting patiently to speak. Greg, forgive me if I got the dates wrong, but I think that you came into JP Morgan to run cybersecurity there in or around 2014, which is just when they'd been hit, or just after they'd been hit by a big cybersecurity attack. And since that point, I think their annual cyber budget at the bank is something like $600 million. So it's quite an interesting case study for the title of the session, which is spending enough? I mean, has spending been enough for that bank? And can you tell us a bit about how it responded to the 2014 attack?
Well, I can tell you a little bit about that. I'd like to just extend, the point that was just being made in the discussion with Grace. I think the real asymmetry is the expectation. I think most of the tools that are out there technically work as advertised. I think what the mismatch is sort of the assumption that the teams that are adopting those tools will be able to operate them and integrate them, as was just being discussed, into very complex environments. And that, there's an interesting question of whether that's the buyer's issue of better understanding how challenging the tool should be to implement, or it's the seller's issue of, should they come with better ability to teach and coach and help implementation occur. And it has to be teach and coach, because basically the use of the tool is going to evolve over time. I think these are not cars. These are actually, the challenge here is giving a car to the appropriate car to the driver, and understanding the driver's skill sets and ability to operate the car. Most of the cars are like our phones. They have tons of features that we will never use, right? And that we don't have the skills to use, or the time to develop the skills to use. I think very fundamentally, the challenge here is that we don't have enough talent on the cyber teams. We can leave the broader workforce issue alone for a second. But that the real reason that we're dissatisfied with the technology is because the environments we put it in are so hard, and our teams don't have the ability to use the features of the tools that are being sold. And I think there's just too much sort of assumption that that's going to be easy. And I think that's actually a two-sided problem. With regard to, using the JP Morgan breach and uplift program, as an example, I do want to start with sort of that your quote, which is the notion that when a company is paying, in this case, I think ransom, or responding to an incident and not publicly notifying people, that's a cover-up. I think we really, really, really have to be careful of blaming the victim. I think some progress has been made, but almost all companies are they do better or worse on investment in cybersecurity and due diligence around the safety aspects for their own stakeholders and for public safety of securing themselves. But to put the burden on the company for acting legally, and doing something that's in their stockholders' interest in making a management decision, the problem, hackers, not the company, right? And I've been through this, right? Like, the reality is, in the JP Morgan case, I got there, we discovered that we had a problem, and we also had very significant media attention, and this all played out, in a sort of public, we were acknowledged that we were breached. We eventually disclosed the sort of nature of the breach over a couple-month period, which is extensive. We did that because we wanted to do due diligence about how bad the harms had been. And, we made an announcement about a couple months after the initial discovery. That's all fairly well publicly documented, because Bloomberg and the New York Times are covering the breach, which is a painful way to enter your job as a chief information security officer. It did quite capture the attention of the JP Morgan leadership, resulting in the, your, correct notion, the publicly announced by a few years later, $600 million program that there has reached a point where that, my understanding is, having left the bank a couple of years ago, that's largely leveled off. And the notion here now is trying to take that investment and focus it more on effectiveness against risk reduction, in addition to just building, the highest level of maturity and best practice. And I think that is actually a much more challenging process than just spending more and trying to acquire. Again, I think the notion of acquiring more tools is actually counterproductive. If you've got more tools in your environment, you're probably less effective in providing cybersecurity because the teams are literally overwhelmed. And I know for a fact, teams are literally breaking their own cybersecurity technology because they have too many tools in the environment, feeding overloaded, SIMs and other sorts of monitoring capabilities. So there's a complexity to this that is very much not about sort of car level lemons, though I very much think Joe's work is on point, and that the scrutiny around the nature of the technology we're buying is really important. I'll stop it there.
Greg, I just want to ask you one follow-up question with that, which is, what about banks particularly working together in this area? Because it's one thing for JP Morgan to spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and that would potentially protect them. But how important is it, particularly in the financial sector, for institutions within the financial sector to form a kind of systemic, coordinated defense against cyber attacks?
Well, as Ciaran well knows, having talked to him about industry efforts in the US when he was leading the UK efforts, I mean, I think it's essential, right? Especially at the systemic level. In financial services are a particularly interconnected industry where it's hard for especially a large institution to even do its job and make money if the other institutions aren't working. So I think the US financial sector is arguably one of the principal, if not the leading example of working together. I mean, literally the CEOs of those banks meet on a regular basis around, how well joint cybersecurity efforts are going. Institutions were formed called the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center and Sheltered Harbor that were industry efforts to set standards on, safe data storage and ability to analyze attacks and work with the government. So I think, certainly agree with the notion. I think the sector has done a lot of work on this, not saying it's sufficient and there's still real risk there, but I think the notion of sectoral and systemic collaboration is part of the solution, because I don't think expecting every enterprise to defend themselves, given the nature really of technology change in addition to the threat, it can't be done solely at the enterprise level.
Let's take some questions or some points from the floor now. We've got Yusuf, but maybe you first of all, if you don't mind. No. Could you introduce yourself and then make your point?
Thanks. Neve Gavin. I'm currently building a computational bio lab in the UK. But I was just wondering how both the practitioners and the investors think about splitting their time between the here and now issues of today versus the future ones that may come down the path. So that classic kind of urgent versus important trade-off, which also in cyber seems to be a little bit coupled to low tech and high tech. So addressing your infrastructure and ransomware today versus in the background potentially are the industrial players that are moving to the next layer, be it satellites or other.
Ciaran, do you want to have a go at that?
It's a great question. I mean, I think nobody's suggesting that today's fixed. So, for example, if there was a really cool solution to ransomware that would, always and everywhere or most of the time spot involuntary encryption of networks and stop it, then somebody deserves to make a fortune out of that. But I think, and again, it comes back to this sort of public-private interface thing. The legacy we've got of the legacy of IT we've got is really hard to fix. You have to stop it. It wasn't built with security in mind, and so forth. So there's a lot of opportunities, both for the sort of public good of a safer digital environment and for investors and entrepreneurs in the safety of new technology. I mean, IoT is a good example. I mean, it's not new anymore, but the nature of the tech market's changing from free access to web-based services, which was the original sort of model, which is really hard to secure and really hard to price security onto things that you buy, objects that you can hold. Then you get service contracts, and you can actually more easily objectively measure that. You then move into use cases of AI where you can see them coming a few years down the line in a way that you couldn't in the 90s and early noughties with some of the web services. So how do public policymakers then set standards that can then entrepreneurs can react to? So I think it's a really, really strong point.
And just on the standards point, can you describe what is happening, if anything, in terms of cybersecurity protection standards? What role are policymakers playing in setting universal standards that would help innovation?
It's a mix, and you've got to break it down. So IoT, some countries, so the UK started doing some interesting things with codes of practice in 2018, has promised legislation. It's not there yet. Singapore has sort of leapfrogged and done it. So that's one area. There's a whole second set of areas around critical regulation that Dimitri and others were talking about, where in my view, it's present in some places like banks already. It's becoming present in this country in telecoms with pending legislation. It's not true anywhere, as far as I know, in things like the relationship with hard infrastructure, like energy as colonial pipeline showed. But there is another, and then there's a whole bunch of the new technologies that people sort of fantasize about, quantum and so forth, where we're beginning to think it through, and standards will emerge over time. But it will never be government prescribed standards that will sort out the whole of the problem. I think one point that all three other speakers have made me reflect on is that we talk a lot about buyers as in, they're just the sort of IT security departments that are doing the buying, and to some extent that's true. And there is a challenge for them. What's this supposed to do? What risk is it supposed to mitigate? What harm is it supposed to stop? But then let's go up a level. Some of this stuff, particularly for larger organizations, quite costly. And there is a sense, I get it, in some organizations, some do it really well, but some, they'll sign off huge amounts of money without really understanding what it does. My favorite example was I was when I was in government, being taken around a critical infrastructure plant. I won't say where it was, but it was in this country, big operational, critically important stuff. And they had the beautiful map of the world, high-tech map of the world with sort of things pinging all over the place. This is what they were detecting. So I said to an analyst, I said, there's somebody in Jordan firing something at somebody in Chile. What's the significance of that? And he just giggled and said, look, perfectly well, that's just for the tourists. So there is something about just saying, what does this do? And there are some brilliant companies where they can actually tell you what this does. And they can, measure it, they can benchmark it, and so forth. But we've got to have more. Government will never make for more discerning buyers, and I'm not talking about the people who understand how the technology works. I'm talking about the people signing the checks at the end or signing the authorizations.
That's so interesting. That question about what does this do? Do you, when you're looking at companies and technologies, is there a framework that you apply to all the companies that you look at, where you can ask, what do you do within a kind of universal framework, or do you look at companies on a case-by-case basis?
I wouldn't say we have a kind of terribly detailed framework that we're applying, but there are some quite common sense things you can do, like, can this person describe to you in 2 minutes what the product does and what difference it will make to a user in terms of having this product to not having this product? I mean, it sounds very basic, but you'd be surprised how many people can't actually articulate that in plain English and can't articulate to a potential user why they would want to have it. Often, an interesting question to ask for anyone who's looking at this kind of stuff is to ask, what do you do now that you could do differently if you had this product? Is there something you have at the moment that is either an alternative vendor's product or is just a solution that you sort of hash together somehow to work around it, that you can stop doing because you're now going to use this product instead? Otherwise, you're just sort of layering more and more very often exquisite solutions on top of other exquisite solutions. And ideally, you want to reduce the number of things that any one security team is trying to operate. As you know, as Greg was saying, that the ideal for us, if you're looking at a company to back, is can a buyer strip out one or more other products in place of this?
There's a gentleman over there, sir.
Hello, this is Rufo Goreski. I'm leading a Trustless Computing Association and the spin-off Trustless AI. In regards to ransomware, data leaks, and confidentiality, is it really a problem of cybersecurity solutions not being good enough? Or is it secure IT not being good enough? To what extent can we fix stuff that is broken deeply, too complex, and often broken by design, technically and by the standards? Isn't the insecurity we have there really a collateral damage of the war on terrorism that we have out there? Now, the UK has been leading in proposing ways to find some kind of backdoor in which we can reconcile the need for privacy with cybersecurity, but it hasn't pushed on the other side also like making things more secure. So the citizens feel that everything is broken already, the only little things that kind of work, and you just also want to put a backdoor there. And so I wanted to ask Mr. Martin if maybe really the solution is there, really trying to find a joint solution of how to make our system radically more secure and use that same approach to make a working front door.
But just before Ciaran answers that, what do you think?
Yes, we have a solution. Check us out.
Hey. You're being pitched.
I would be happy to look at it with interest. I don't think there's a single solution to the general poor quality of cyber hygiene in our economies. And even if you could, and indeed the government, as I understand it, has launched a competition to try to find the magic spot between the protection of end-to-end encryption and detectability of serious harm, particularly child sexual exploitation. The prize is £85,000. I suspect if somebody does that, because they will earn a lot more than that and deserve to. But just really quickly, I do think, as a general rule, that there are complex trade-offs and so forth. But when the two are in balance, my underlying philosophy, I don't speak for the government anymore, is that safer security needs to win. We need a safer digital environment that benefits free and open societies more than exploiting its insecurities does.
And just to follow you up with you on that, can you just mention what is happening now in terms of the government's viewpoint on cyber and your concerns in terms of the direction that's leading, specifically the focus on offensive capabilities and the relationship between focusing on offensive capabilities and potentially undermining domestic safety?
Well, I think there are a couple of points in that. I mean, we wait and see what the government comes out with in its new cyber strategy. But I think, look, in terms of the title of this session, does more spending, is more spending the answer? I mean, the first time I met Greg, I think JP Morgan was one of the first corporate visitors to the National Cybersecurity Centre when it was opened, and it was somewhat sobering, as I was delighted that our budget was increasing from £150 million to £300 million for the whole country, to be told that his budget was $600 million US dollars. So I very much had to reconcile immediately to the fact that money wasn't going to do everything. But interestingly, even when we were thinking about it towards the end of my time, you're thinking about what will make Britain safer online. Sure, maintaining a central capability like the NCSC is important, but if you're going to just concentrate on critical infrastructure, that's going to be spent mostly by private companies. So it's partly where you put money, where you put it. But in terms of future direction, I think there are two things to watch out for. One is the point I've just made. It is not always the case, it's sometimes oversimplified, but it's not always the case where the general security of ourselves, and therefore, because of the integration of digital systems, most of the rest of the world, if we make things safer, it sometimes makes it harder for our own agents operating lawfully in the national interest through offensive means. It doesn't always do it, but it does sometimes. For me, by and large, that is a price worth paying. Open free societies will benefit more from a from a safer, cleaner, healthier digital environment. Secondly, I think we just need to be a little bit realistic about the utility of some of the offensive tools. They're sometimes sort of hyped up, not so much in sort of formal, boring government documents, but they're sometimes hyped up in the way that that is reported and expressed and debated as some sort of panacea. Actually, when, there are questions, when are you going to use these things? Often against terrorist groups, and that should be, that is often effective and appropriate. It doesn't do anything for your cybersecurity, though. And if you take, for example, at the turn of the year, a lot of very excitable voices on Capitol Hill in Washington saying that the response to a Russian spying operation had to be an offensive cyber strike. Against what? What are you going to do that for? Maybe you should take out some of the ransomware groups, but are you going to take out the power to a Russian city full of civilians in response to a spying operation? So we need to think through what's most important of all. To go back to the point about the importance of a safer digital environment, is we don't lose focus. Offensive cyber, whatever different views people have on its utility, is not going to solve the problem of chronic digital insecurity here. That's going to be a mixture of some clever policy making, some public resources, but mostly a well-functioning free open market in cybersecurity and IT security in general.
Thank you very much. Joe, we started off with your report and we're coming to the end. We've got to bring in Nick in a second, but you talked to dozens of chief security officers, dozens of insiders. In terms of solutions, what did you come up with?
Well, it's not what I came up with. Oh, sorry, my phone. It's not what I came up with. It's actually what the cohort came up with. So the overwhelming conclusion from the cohort was that buyers need to trigger greater transparency from the vendors of cybersecurity technology. I know Greg's point that it's not as simple as buying a car, but you still need the transparency of what am I buying, what's it going to do, how will this help me reduce my risk? It's not a simple question, but just being able to understand how will this reduce my risk is the first step. So the conclusion of the cohort was, number one, buyers need to demand greater transparency from their vendors. Number two, and this was 70+% of the people that I spoke to, and they won't say it in public, but they want more regulation. And I thought Dimitri's point was great. The only thing I wanted to say to Dimitri was, what about regulating the cybersecurity vendors? So, because why do we trust them to bring things to market that haven't been evaluated when you trust the security of your company to it? So first of all, we need a movement to demand greater transparency in the market. Secondly, maybe in the end, there'll be some kind of regulation around that.
And are the two related points? Would you get transparency through mandated transparency?
The sense I have from follow-on interviews is that we need the buying side, the major enterprises, to demand the transparency first, and then the regulators will respond to it. Now, the regulation I'm talking about is not what the EU Cyber Act is doing at the moment. Now, I'm a Europhile, don't get me wrong, but you talked about regulation. The Cyber Act in the EU is currently going through demanding standards, but it's standards based on defining the technology. And that's like defining how people should play football. We don't need to say how to play football. We need more referees who can stand there and stand between the buyer and the seller and say, this does this, here's the information that you need to make your risk-based decision, and therefore the buyer can make a better buying choice. So I think the regulation required is not to say you have to build the widget in this way, it's that the widget needs to pass some simple tests around efficacy before it's allowed onto the market.
I'd like to ask Grace about regulation in a second, but I just wanted to ask you. We've talked in quite a lot of abstract terms about these issues, but kind of when it comes down to it, and you're talking about what is a lemon.
Yeah.
Give us an example of a lemon.
Well, so I won't name the vendors, but at home I try to drink my own champagne, or whatever the phrase is. If you try and buy cybersecurity for your home, for your devices, for your kids in the house, and then you try and configure any of these antivirus and all these funny solutions, I make a point of changing them every couple of months to try and be on it at home as well. And I find it really difficult to figure out, is my kid's iPad really protected, or are they now unable to do the stuff I thought they were able to do? So, I mean, think in your own environment of how you interact with the cybersecurity market. And when you're trying to buy these home antivirus solutions, whether or not you really think in these VPNs, is this really doing what I thought it was going to do? How do I actually figure it out? That's when it gets real. I mean, during the work, I spoke to, tens of CISOs that are buying firewalls for relatively small enterprises, and they say, we actually don't know if we've configured it right. And this is like, how long have firewalls been around, right? So it's extremely simple. Like, cybersecurity is actually quite boring when you get to the heart of it. It's just about getting your config.
Don't say
right.
that. You've got a whole day of it.
But it doesn't need to be complicated, sorry. But yeah, it's actually it's more difficult than it should be. And Greg's point is that when he was saying, you've got to have the right talent to manage the technology. I actually think the technology shouldn't be released to the market until it's easy enough to use. Because you can't expect everyone to be a Top Gun pilot.
Grace, very quickly on regulation. What is the right level of innovation of regulation that we need that will not stop you and startups doing what you need to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think my guess is that many startup founders would welcome a certain degree of regulation because none of them want to be accused of selling lemons and so forth. So I think there'd be a certain degree of receptivity to increase regulation. I think there'd be quite a lot of concern about outsourcing any kind of judgment on the efficacy of their product to a third party without really knowing how that third party was going to test and what circumstances would the test take place in. What might work very well in a test lab against a certain configuration in a certain architecture may work differently when it's then live in a customer's environment, which has a very different setup and configuration, and yet you've had a score of this in one scenario, and actually you may work better or worse in a different setup. So I think, I'm not sure there's an easy answer. I think Joe's ideas and his cohort's ideas around efficacy regulation are important. I think they're quite complex to make happen in reality because of this complexity issue where you're never really making a product perform to the same level. It's never deployed in exactly the same scenario. It's a bit like no medicine works exactly the same in a group of 10 people who have different DNA, different microbiomes and so forth. I think there's a unfortunate reality here that because of the complexity that Greg was also talking about, it's hard to say with regulation that this product does this and it does it to this level of efficacy.
For the last couple of minutes, thank you, Grace. That was great. Let's bring in Nick Coleman, the author of the Coleman report, which is widely read cyber publication. Nick, could you just give us a bit about your background and then give us your reactions on what you've heard today?
That's simple. Good afternoon and nice to be with you. This is the first in-person event I've done for 2 years, probably like many of you, so it's wonderful and a bit daunting. I've been in cybersecurity in a variety of different roles. I was in the technology industry in IBM and led things for there across cyber risk and regulation globally. Previous to that, I was with the UK government as a National Review of Security and wrote Coleman report, as we've touched on. And then I'm currently at Vocalink, which is a Mastercard company, which does real-time payments in the UK and around the world. So for those of you who understand backs or faster payments or transfers you're doing, I am the Chief Security Officer for all that operation that runs 24/7. I think it's been a great discussion, and Ciaran and Grace, all the discussion we've had. The first thing I think is, when we talk about tools, I think about capabilities. So I don't think about buying a widget. I think about what is it going to actually achieve, and where does it fit in that ecosystem with what you're trying to actually build. And I think that I just picked up the regulatory thing. I hope that people don't think the regulation is what will drive the product sale. The amount of people who are telling you that they can address a regulation and they can solve your problem. If that's what we mean by regulation, I think we're in the wrong discussion, because for me it comes back to capabilities again. And I think the conversation we talked about the short term or the long term, I've been involved in something that the wider Mastercard company do called threat casting, which gets us to look every year up to 10 years out. And we do it with across financial services organizations and with the help of a threat caster, who I've read the book. And it's an interesting topic if any of you are thinking about it, which actually starts you to think about how that future is evolving and where you need to build out. So it is both your current operation, the roadmap you've got there, but also an eye on the future. The other bit, which we haven't really talked about, is frameworks today, I think. So when we're talking about how you're building out security, there is, I think the most commonly referred probably is the NIST cybersecurity framework from the US government: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. There we go. There is also, in the financial services, something called the Cyber Risk Institute, which takes that and tailors that for financial services institutions. Those kind of frameworks really help me think about capability and where that capability comes to bear. And then, of course, you can relay that to the architecture. I think picking up on Grace's comments, which I fully support, like, you know, you've got to be able to explain what it is you do, you've got to be able to explain the benefits. I think you've also got to explain, does it replace something you already have? Or does it augment it? And think about those are already, in most cases, living, breathing environments that you're evolving. So, you know, that market and where you're trying to present it to, does it fit that market? And the final thing, which is, I think when we talk to enterprise, is scalability. You know, these things, as I think you sort of talked about proof of concepts, what you really need to know is, can it scale to X thousand, can it users, or can it scale to a 24/7 operation and really have that? I was talking to one insurance company recently, and one of their cyber leaders said, it's good, we can actually survive 3-4 days if we have an interruption, because really in our scenario, we're really worried about our book of business, really, and understanding whether we should pay claims or not. So actually there is some time that we have in the window. Whereas in other scenarios, we have, you know, that availability has to be there 24/7. And so understanding your use cases and understanding your traction is really helpful. I am tempted to talk about the peer network. I mean, a lot of us do benchmark and talk to other organizations, but again, comparing our journeys, and we do that in some of the forums, like, for example, the information exchanges that Ciaran and the team set up, so the Financial Services Information Exchange, which runs in the UK, but we have them globally with others. So we are collaborating, and collaboration is crucial. I think inevitably, you know, in terms of evaluating solutions, it's really got to go back to, does it work for your environment? Do you understand it? And have you got the support to implement it? And certainly, you know, that's top of mind.
Thank you so much. I can't believe we're only 2 minutes over. So we've got plenty of time to have a little break before the next session, which I'm also hosting, which is all about who is the most vulnerable in the cyber world. So we're going to be talking about victims and how to protect them. So do stick around. We've got some great guests. But thank you, Grace. Thank you, Joe, Ciaran, Nick, and Greg as well from the US. Thank you very much. Round of applause.